Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon deck profile video. So today is going to be a little bit of a different video where one of my friends has tasked me to build a MetalSeadramon deck because that is his favorite Digimon, and this deck is going to be a little bit different because it's not trying to be hyper competitive, so some of the cards aren't going to be as optimized as they could be, but this is the list my friend is planning on running for his MetalSeadramon deck because this is his favorite Digimon, and he asked me to build a deck around it. The whole style of the deck is going to be themed around attacking the opponent's Digivolution sources, and I definitely think it is a underappreciated strategy just because so many decks actually rely a lot on their Digivolution sources, trying to have them do stuff, especially in 1.0. So the fact that you have a style of deck that can disrupt that and really put the opponent off their game just from you doing it is definitely really interesting to think about, and there's so many ways you could build this style of deck, depending on which cards you want to support, that it's actually a really interesting deck, and I think it's a really solid deck, even though it's not going to be like tier 1 competitive. But again, this is all just for my friend because he is just starting the Digimon card game, and he just wants to play his favorite Digimon. So going over the deck really quickly, starting with the Digitama, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Upamon. So Upamon is just Blue's best Digitama in the game because of his when attacking ability, where you get to basically draw a card if the opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources in it. So again, the whole theme is attacking the Digivolution sources, so it's even easier to trigger Upamon's ability to draw a card, and drawing a card is just very good. And then the last Digitama is going to be 1 copy of Wanyamon. So Wanyamon is still a pretty solid Digimon just because his inheritable ability is something we still really want. So his inheritable is while your opponent has 2 or more Digimon with no Digivolution sources in play, this Digimon gets plus 2000 DP. So it's really easy to get the opponent to have Digimon with no Digivolution sources, and because Blue doesn't really have the highest quality of level 6s, it definitely means that the 2000 DP boost does matter just so we could try to hit higher numbers to be able to clear the opponent's security that much easier. Next, on to the rookies, I'm going to be running 3 copies of Gabumon. So this Gabumon is pretty solid just because he has the on-play ability of drawing a card. We're not exactly playing too much with on-play synergy. Depending on how you build the deck, you definitely could play a little bit more heavier on the on-play synergy, but we're not really going to. But the fact that he just has a statically decent ability is why we're running him. Next, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Gomamon. So this version of Gomamon is pretty good just because he has a really nice inheritable of on deletion gaining 1 memory. Even though I do understand that the promo Gomamon is a lot better and definitely should be fitting this slot rather than this Gomamon, again, my friend isn't hyper competitive and he doesn't exactly care about using the most optimized cards. So this Gomamon just having an inheritable that's still playable is still very good, but this totally should be the promo Gomamon. Next, I'm going to be running 4 copies of the Starter Deck Gomamon. So the Starter Deck Gomamon is just your value vanilla card. There's nothing else really too special about him. And then the last rookie of the deck is going to be 4 copies of the Starter Deck Gabumon. So the Starter Deck Gabumon is pretty important because he has this nice when attacking inheritable ability where you get to trash the Digivolution card off the bottom of one of your opponent's Digimon that's level 5 or less. So this is just one way that we are going to be attacking the opponent's Digivolution sources, and definitely pair that up with MetalSeadramon, and this could be a really powerful card because let's just say the opponent Digivolved up into a blocker, and then you can use MetalSeadramon to swing with Gabumon in its evolution source, and then Gabumon will get rid of its evolution source, and then it'll make MetalSeadramon unblockable. So that's just one line of play this card could lead, but it's also just really good, again, at just attacking the opponent's Digimon with Digivolution sources. Next, on to the champions, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Dolphmon. So Dolphmon is probably a really underrated card just because he's not exactly the most useful card most of the time, but in this style of deck, he's actually really important just because his inheritable ability is something we really need. So what his inheritable ability is doing is during your turn, while your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources in it, then this Digimon gets plus 1000 DP. So like I said before, blue exactly doesn't have the most powerful of Digimon, so we definitely need ways to DP boost our Digimon so that way they could be even more powerful than they are normally. So that way they're a lot safer to aggress with it than they normally would be. And Dolphmon is just one of the only cards that we have that could fit that role. And because we're already playing with the theme of trying to get rid of the opponent's Digivolution sources, it's not hard to get his ability to be online. Next, I'm going to be running 4 copies of the starter deck Garurumon. So the starter deck Garurumon is a pretty solid Digimon just because he is doing very similar things to the Gabumon, where he's attacking the opponent's Digimon's Digivolution sources, and this just gets rid of one of the opponent's Digivolution sources off the bottom of one of their Digimon. So this is just, again, very, very powerful, so that way it just makes your abilities that matter when you don't have Digivolution sources even easier to get off. And then the last champion of the deck is going to be 4 copies of Grizzlymon. So Grizzlymon is just the blocker of the deck. Next up, onto the ultimates, I'm going to be running 3 copies of Monzaemon. So Monzaemon is in here just because he is the value-efficient ultimate, where he has a really low play cost and really low evolution cost, and that's all we're looking to use the card for. Is if we don't have a rookie, then he's just a cheap ultimate to play, or if we need to Digivolve up into something, then he has a cheap evolution cost, so that way we could get to our higher stages more efficiently. Next, I'm going to be running 2 copies of LoaderLiomon. So LoaderLiomon is in here just because he has 10,000 DP. So that's really all we're looking to use the card for, is the fact that he is just as powerful as some of our megas that we could or would be using. And the fact that he is that powerful as an ultimate definitely means that you could use him to aggress a lot easier and a lot faster onto the opponent's security with, and then you could just Digivolve him whenever you feel like. And then the last ultimate of the deck is going to be 3 copies of the starter deck WereGarurumon. So this WereGarurumon is really, really solid just because he has a nice inheritable ability of during your turn, while your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources, then it gains Security Attack +1. So Security Attack +1 is pretty nice just because it allows you to deal more damage faster, and because our Digimon generally are going to be a lot weaker than our opponent, having a slightly higher damage output definitely helps us be able to race and compete with the opponent. Next, on to the Megas. I'm going to be running 4 copies of MetalSeadramon. So MetalSeadramon is one of my friend's favorite Digimon, and as such, I just had to put him at 4, just because my friend really, really wants to play the card. So he has 2 really good abilities. He has a nice on-play ability, where you get to return 2 of the opponent's level 4 or lower Digimon back into their hand, and then trash all their Digivolution sources. And then he also has another ability where during your turn, this Digimon can't be blocked by the opponent's Digimon with no Digivolution sources. So we're really trying to utilize him for his second ability to make him unblockable more than his on-play ability, but the fact that we still can play him just as is still really, really important, just because it can help deal with a lot of potential problems that the opponent might be trying to set up. But again, we're really looking to try to utilize the unblockable ability because we're trying to get rid of the opponent's Digivolution sources to make him unblockable, so that way they can't stop the damage. And if we break all of their security fast enough and then slam a MetalSeadramon, make him unblockable, then that's just going to end up being GG. So MetalSeadramon is definitely a really good card. The only unfortunate thing about him is the fact that he only has 10,000 DP, but that's why we kind of need cards like Dolphmon and Wanyamon, so that way we could boost his DP so that he could potentially live through security checks if he's the one that's actually going to be trying to check the security. And then the last mega is going to be 2 copies of the MetalGarurumon from the starter deck. So this is really only in here just because it's a very decent mega to be playing around with. Yes, I understand its Digivolution cost is a little on the higher side, with some not so high DP compared to some of his contemporaries, but the fact that he has this nice when attacking ability once per turn, you could unsuspend him, means that you could pair this up with like Garurumon or Gabumon to just start picking off the opponent's Digivolution sources, and then on top of which, if you have WereGarurumon in his source, then he could be hitting for up to 2 to 4 security in one turn, and that's just still really, really powerful to think about, especially if he's boosted by Dolphmon, so that way he has a little bit of a better chance at surviving through the opponent's security checks. So overall, MetalGarurumon is still just a very, very solid card for the style of deck that we're going to be running, based on some of the card choices that we're going to be running. Next, onto the options, I'm going to be running 4 copies of Hammerspark. So Hammerspark is an absolutely insane card just because it's a 0-cost option card that allows us to gain 1 memory. So this allows us to make certain plays that we normally wouldn't be able to make otherwise, and it's just overall a very fantastic card to use. On top of which, it has a really nice security ability of gaining 2 memory, which is effectively taking away 2 memory from the opponent. So that could potentially screw up some of their plays and really put them off of their game. And then the last option of the deck is going to be 2 copies of Cocytus Breath. So Cocytus Breath is just a really solid option card because this is basically Blue's Gaia Force, where it's one of the only cards we have in the deck to interact with the opponent's field, and we definitely still need a way to interact with the opponent's field. Otherwise, letting them do whatever they want is still going to end up being a very bad thing for us because we won't be able to contest with anything that they're doing. So the fact that we need Cocytus Breath to bounce one of the opponent's Digimon back to their hand is still very, very important and very, very powerful, especially if it's in the security. Then you get to use its main ability to, again, bounce something back to the opponent's hand. And again, that's just really, really powerful because it's acting as one of the only ways we could disrupt the opponent. And then the last card of the deck is going to be the only Tamer of the deck, and that's going to be 3 copies of Matt. So this version of Matt is pretty solid because he's the memory fixing Tamer of the deck, where if your memory is 2 or less, then it becomes 3. So this just allows us to Digivolve up into MetalSeadramon that much more efficiently. And then on top of which, he has a very nice ability where during your turn, when you play a blue Digimon, you can suspend this Tamer and trash it the bottom Digivolution source off of one of the opponent's Digimon. So we're not playing around a whole lot with on-play abilities. We are going to be doing it a tiny bit with MetalSeadramon in case we just need to raw slam him. And then we do have the on-play Gabumon that we could use. And then we have the cheap Gomamon and the cheap Monzaemon. So it's not like it's impossible to get the ability off, even though we're not trying to utilize on-play effects a whole lot. But the fact that he fixes our memory and can help trash some of the Digivolution sources is the primary reason on why he's in the deck. And then as far as other options of cards that you could run, there's still a whole bunch of really solid cards that you could think about depending on how you want to build the deck. You could swap out the starter MetalGarurumon for the normal MetalGarurumon. So this one just allows you to play a level 4 or lower Digimon from its Digivolution source for free. And then that'll also trigger Matt. And then on top of which we have some really good on-play abilities on our level 3s or 4s. So we could pair that up with something like the promo Gabumon, where we could use his on-play ability to trash one of the Digivolution sources off the bottom of one of the opponent's Digimon. And then obviously we have the whole Garurumon combo where it makes him active so he could attack again. So there's that kind of synergy that you could utilize. On top of which, you could also think about using the Zudomon to help you with some other on-play abilities because he has the nice on-play ability of drawing you 2 cards. And then on top of which, his Inheritable will also gain you memory on attack if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources, which again, based on the style of deck, that's not very hard to do. And then on top of all that, you could utilize the promo Gomamon, like I mentioned earlier, where every time you're going to be trashing one of the opponent's Digivolution sources, as long as he is in the Inheritable, then once per turn, you're going to be gaining memory, and gaining that memory is still going to be really, really good. On top of which, you still have a whole bunch of other really good budget options. Like you could consider using the Zudomon from the starter deck if you want to go a little bit more budget friendly. So that way you just Digivolve up into him and trash 2 evolution sources off the bottom of one of the opponent's Digimon. So he's just attacking multiple sources at once. Similarly, if you want to go a little bit more budget friendly, you could also think about using LoaderLiomon, just for very similar reasons as why you would run something like the starter deck Zudomon, just to trash a whole bunch of Digivolution sources off of the opponent's Digimon. And then if you're still considering the on-play synergies, you could also think about running Leopardmon, because Leopardmon is doing a very similar thing to MetalGarurumon. I just think MetalGarurumon for the style of deck works a little bit better, but if you want, Leopardmon is still just a very solid option to think about, just because all of your level 4 or lowers are going to gain jamming, so that way you could utilize your level 4s or lower a little bit more aggressively than you could otherwise, so that way you try to make MetalSeadramon unblockable and then have him be the game finisher because he's unblockable. So there is that synergy there that you could be playing around with. And then as far as some of the other megas that you could be playing around with, Plesiomon would really only be in the deck if you want to use him, just because if you're buying a starter deck, he's in the starter deck, on top of which he has a low evo cost and high DP, and the high DP is really all we'd be looking to utilize the card for, just because, again, we don't really have a whole lot of quality Digimon that have some solid DP, so having Plesiomon have 12,000 DP does matter a lot, just because he could win a lot of security checks against the opponent. And then we could also think about running Omnimon, because this is a blue deck and Omnimon is just good. And then depending on what some of the other cards that we're utilizing, we could also think about running Ikkakumon just to make our alternate mega into an unblockable Digimon, similarly to how MetalSeadramon is going to be unblockable. So there's just a whole bunch of potential Digimon and synergy that you could utilize for the deck. On top of which, we do have access to a couple of interesting options. I feel like most of the options for blue are actually really, really bad, but we still kind of need to fix the DP boost problem, and Mad Dog Fire is still a very solid card at just generically DP boosting your Digimon. You could use something like V-Nova Blast to make him have jamming. I just feel like the efficiency of Mad Dog Fire on top of the security ability make this a little bit more desirable versus some of the other blue options. And then on top of which, we also, again, if you're playing more into the on-play style of trying to get rid of the opponent's evolution sources, then Kaiser Nail is still a very, very solid card for that role, just because it allows you to split your Digivolution stacks into new Digimon, and then you get to use all of their on-play effects again. So there's always that possibility as well. And then you still have access to a couple of different Tamers depending on how you want to build the deck. So Joe is also a pretty solid one just for generically gaining you memory whenever you remove one of the opponent's Digivolution sources. And then Matt from the starter deck is also really, really good at just generically gaining you memory at the start of your turn if your opponent has a Digimon with no Digivolution sources in it. So there's just a whole bunch of different things that you could do with the deck and a whole bunch of ways you could customize and utilize the deck. And I think when 1.5 comes out, the deck definitely does get a lot better, again, depending on the types of tools that you're trying to utilize and focus on. But for the most part, this is just the deck. I think it's a really interesting deck, and it definitely utilizes a lot of really interesting and different tools that most players aren't exactly familiar with just because they haven't been playing around with them. And I definitely think that the deck does have some merit, even if it isn't top tier, like hyper competitive. It still has a lot of very powerful elements and very powerful things going on with it. And again, I made this mainly for my friend just because he wants to play MetalSeadramon, and I think MetalSeadramon is actually a pretty solid card when used correctly. So that's kind of all I really have for this video. As always, I'll have the deck list down in the description below. Feel free to tell me your thoughts about the deck in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.